yeah, in this talk, I will speak a little bit about the project that I have to carry out here in Tübingen. And as Thomas said, the project and the talk are titled Paradigms and Research Programs in Logic in the Case of Proof-theoretic Semantics. And as the title suggests, the topic of the talk and of the project is basically the idea that we can apply Kuhn and Lakatos pictures for the reconstruction of the historical and conceptual development of science to the history of logic, and in particular to the opposition between realism and constructivism in logic and the foundations of mathematics, or more in general, realism and anti-realism. I just want to remark that this is a talk about some programmatic ideas, so it is open to suggestions, questions, also objections, of course. Now, so this is the overview of the talk. You shall find here written in green some background topics which I do not want to deal with immediately in my project, not because they are not worth being investigated, but because they tend to be broad topics, which are in a sense less urgent than the topics which are instead written in red. So I will start from some background notions concerning Kuhn, Lakatos, and their applicability to the history of mathematics, and then we have the first urgent research topic, urgent for me, of course, which is about the Phrygian Revolution. So I want to specify two things. First, when I speak of the Phrygian Revolution, which is, of course, the revolution in logic starting from the second half of the 19th century, I should actually say the Phrygian Hilbertian Revolution in logic, because when so if a revolution has occurred in logic in the last century or so, this is due to both Frege and Hilbert on a par, but I decided to use the expression the Phrygian Revolution to stick to the title of a quite well-known paper written by Donald Gillis, titled indeed The Phrygian Revolution in Logic. So another remark is about, you may ask why a project about the opposition between realism and constructivism should be concerned, should be interested in the Phrygian Revolution. And now, of course, the point is that since the aim of the talk and of the project is that of reading the opposition between realism and constructivism through the lens of Kuhn's and Lakatos theories, it of course makes sense to ask questions like, so for example, whether there can be revolutions in logic or whether there have been revolutions in logic. And now an ideal candidate for these questions is, of course, given by this Phrygian Hilbertian revolution. And as you shall see, not everyone agrees on the fact that Frege and Hilbert did actually provoke a revolution in logic. Then I will tell you something about what I take realism and constructivism to be, of course, for what is of interest for me in this talk and in the project. And then I shall try to propose the idea that we can identify in today's logic a sort of Kuhnian logical paradigm. Now, this is a green topic, so it is not, immediate topic, but of course, this could be a research topic in itself, but in a sense, I think the subsequent topic to be more important for, my project, or more urgent. So this basically is the idea that we can understand constructivism as a logical research program, where the notion of research program is understood in Lakatos' sense. And this notion of logic, so this topic includes three subtopics. The first one is whether it makes sense to speak of a logical research program in Lakatos' sense, and to my mind, this can be done following something which is called mathematical research program, and that's an idea which has been put forward by Hallett in the 70s, and then whether constructivism can be understood in the sense of logical research program, and whether Prawitz is, in this constructivism is of course exemplified by a number of theories, and I decided to focus on two theories in particular, namely Prawitz's proof-theoretic semantics and Martin-Löf's intuitionistic type theory. And now the third subtopic is whether Prawitz's semantics and Martin-Löf's type theory, qua parts of constructivism, can be also understood as parts of this logical research program when this notion has been precisely defined. And finally, if time permits, I will try to present some more concrete outcomes of the research that I've been carrying out in the first 3 months since when I'm here, namely the idea that Prawitz's proof-theoretic semantics can be understood basically in Hilbertian terms. Now, of course, Prawitz's proof-theoretic semantics stems from Kensen's general proof theory, so of course it has been connected with Hilbert's program or proof theory, or in general with Hilbert's conception of logic, but to my mind there are deeper reasons why proof-theoretic semantics can be understood along Hilbertian lines, and if time permits I will speak about this too. Now, a quick reminder about Kuhn. Kuhn believes that what we call normal science is what we call science is what he calls normal science, and this is a puzzle-solving activity within a dominant paradigm. This dominant paradigm is not expected, nor is it able to explain everything, but if there is some serious anomaly which the paradigm is not able to explain and which resists any attempt at trying to solve it, a crisis may open up and alternative approaches may start fighting against each other. And if the paradigm is not able to self-adjust, one of these alternative approaches eventually wins and establishes a new paradigm, so a proper revolution is accomplished. And two things must be remarked now. First, that for Kuhn, when shifting from the old to the new paradigm, there is not an inclusion, namely some problems, methods, techniques, solutions, etc., from the old paradigm are not simply transferred into the new one, and vice versa. So these problem solutions, techniques, etc., may make little sense or even no sense in the new paradigm, and vice versa. So there is more a sort of overlapping or intersection, or better, a translation from the old into the new paradigm of some of the notions at play in the old paradigm, but not an inclusion in any case. And the second remark is that the victory, so to say, of the new paradigm does not depend on scientific reasons, according to Kuhn, but mostly on and mainly on sociological reasons. So this happens thanks to sociological factors. And it is partly against this anti-scientific attitude of Kuhn that Lakatos has developed an alternative approach, which is based on this notion of research program. And now the idea is that scientific theories do not develop in isolation, but in sequences. And in these sequences, one can identify what Lakatos calls the core, which is made of a number of principles which members of the research program consider as untouchable and as qualifying the program as such, so that if one of these principles crumbles down, also the program may crumble down. And then in the periphery of the research program, we have what Lakatos calls the protective belt, which is made of a number of hypotheses which are put forward in order to comply with, face with, or cope with counterexamples to principles contained in the core, which may come either from the outer world or from results or achievements or findings in the program itself, which are incompatible with the principles contained in the core. And why is this more scientific? Well, because now we have a number of criteria for evaluating when a program is progressive or regressive from an either theoretical or empirical or both a theoretical and empirical point of view. And also we have heuristics, which can be either positive or negative. The positive heuristics basically of the program will basically tell members of the program which questions should be addressed, solved, whereas the negative heuristics will tell members of the program which questions should be, so to say, kept silent or avoided because they may be dangerous for the program itself. Now, Kuhn's and Lakatos theories have been applied fruitfully to a number of scientific fields, in particular to physics and chemistry, but it is not clear whether they can be applied to formal sciences, in particular to mathematics. And there is this nice source book edited by Donald Gillis called Revolutions in Mathematics, where you can basically identify three positions. The first one is held by Crow, for example, who has written this paper about 10 laws in the history of mathematics. And the 10th law says that revolutions never occur in mathematics. Then there is a middle position, which has been held, for example, by Dunmore. According to Dunmore, basically, Crow is right in saying that revolutions never occur in mathematics. Now, the in becomes very important because Dunmore also says that revolutions can occur in mathematics. Of course, this notion of mathematics by Dunmore is not to be understood in a strictly Hilbertian sense, but more in a broad sense where we take mathematics to be a theory about principles of reasoning at play in mathematical reasoning, or the way we conceive of mathematical practice, or the way we understand mathematics in general, and so on. And finally, there is another position, which is, for example, represented by Dauben, According to Dauben, Kuhn's theories can be applied to the history of mathematics. The problem is not with Kuhn, but with Crow, because Crow has a too narrow conception of what a scientific revolution is as referred to mathematics, because for Crow, a revolution is accomplished when the previous approach is completely overthrown or disregarded, whereas this is not how things go in science and in mathematics in particular, not even when we take into account these Kuhn's laws, this incommensurability of paradigms. So if we have a weaker notion of revolution, we can see that Kuhn's picture can be applied to the history of mathematics. But now, if the question whether Kuhn's and Lakatos theories can be applied to the history of mathematics is in a way discussed, it is, I would say, mostly unexplored when referred to that subdiscipline of mathematics, which logic has come to be starting from the second half of the 19th century. And basically, here we have, to my mind, very few sources. So we have some names are Gillis and Cellucci. Then there are also papers by Oliveri, Bueno, and Morriconi, but I mean, not so many. And basically, two main positions can be identified. The first one is what I call the discontinuous position. Gillis, for example, is a discontinuist because he believes that Frege did provoke a revolution in logic. And now Gillis' picture is very interesting to me, and I mean, in the context of my project, because Gillis uses a sort of mixed approach where he takes some Kuhnian ingredients and mix them with Lakatosian ingredients. At the same time renouncing something from Kuhn and something from Lakatos. And I say this because an objection which people generally make when I present the ideas that I'm going to present in this talk is that you cannot have a Kuhnian paradigm next to a Lakatosian research program. Either you go totally Kuhnian or you go totally Lakatosian. And now my idea is that, well, this is true, but one can have a mixed approach where one has, for example, a more flexible paradigm which goes in the direction of a Lakatosian research program, and a more rigid research program which tends to become or may become a Kuhnian paradigm. So this is important. And Gillis' approach is also nice because he introduces this distinction between the Franco-British Revolution and Russian revolutions, or Soviet revolution. I don't remember the other one. But basically, the idea is that in Franco-British Revolution, the previous regime is not completely abandoned, and something is kept, whereas in Russian or Soviet Revolution, the previous regime is abandoned. I don't know whether, so this paper is from 1992, so I don't know whether Gillis would still, subscribe to this distinction now, but I mean, in any case, this is not an objection because he takes scientific revolutions to be always of a Franco-British kind. So they always keep something from the previous approach. The previous approach is not completely disregarded. So this is what I would say the main point in Gillis' approach. Cellucci, for example, is a continuist. He believes that Frege did not provoke any revolution in logic, that he is completely in the Aristotelian tradition, both conceptually and methodologically. Conceptually, because he wanted to provide foundation for something, not for science in general, as Aristotle wanted to do, but for mathematics in particular. So it's not a general foundational attitude, but a tailored foundational attitude. So a foundation for a subfield of science in general. And also methodologically, Frege still belongs to that deductivist attitude that we can find in Aristotle's logic. But in general, for example, Cellucci also emphasizes that in Aristotle, we don't have a deductivist part only in his logic, but also an heuristic part where basically the problem is finding the optimal hypothesis which explain a given conclusion, which Aristotle called problemata. And according to Cellucci, this part of Aristotle's logic has been lost, starting with basically with Leibniz. So why is this, I take this to be urgent? Well, of course, because if you have to justify a Kuhn and Lakatosian reading of the opposition between realism and constructivism, you should in a way settle the question whether there can be revolutions in logic. And so, and since now realism and constructivism today depends in a way on the work by Frege and Hilbert, one has to, so I have to address this question. And now, to my mind, the continuist and the discontinuist approach are not completely incompatible. They can be made compatible by using a theory which has been developed by a Slovak mathematician who will give a talk in this colloquium. I think end of January, maybe on January 22nd, if I'm not wrong. His name is Ladislav Kvaš. I'm not advertising him, but it's just because it's very interesting. I mean, he has written this book titled Patterns of Change, Linguistic Innovation in the Development of Classical Mathematics is the subtitle. This is basically his dissertation written under the supervision of Donald Gillis. And in this book, he basically says that, well, we can apply Kuhn's theories to the history of mathematics, but we have to give a more fine-grained notion of mathematical revolution. Kuhn's notion of revolution is too shallow or too naive, so to say. The point being that according to Kvaš, there can be three kinds of revolutions in mathematics: recodings, relativizations, and reformulations. I will not go through this now, but I will just say that recodings are basically revolutions where you speak about one and the same field from a previous approach to another, to a new approach, and you do this with different syntaxes. So you use different languages for speaking about the same things. And according to Kvaš, Frege provoked a recoding in logic relative to the stage of the history of mathematics where Frege's work can be located. And so, from this point of view, why is this important to? So, from this point of view, one can say that, well, Frege conceptually and methodologically did not provoke any revolution, because it is true that he was foundational and deductivist, but from a linguistic point of view, he introduced the revolution so his work was revolutionary because he introduced the new language, basically. He abandoned the paradigm which was at play in Aristotle, namely the idea that the logical structure of sentences should be always analyzed in the form of subject predicate, and he preferred this form with function argument. And thanks to this, he could develop a rich theory of quantification, which basically opened up a completely new field. So he was a continuist in spirit, but so he was discontinuist I mean, technically. Then, of course, when you introduce a linguistic innovation, this will also be a conceptual innovation, because you take your language to speak about something, some objects in some domain. So from this point of view, it was also conceptually revolutionary. But in any case, my idea is that you can use Kvaš's theory to show that both from the previous slide, Gillis and Cellucci are in a sense right, or both are wrong, if you prefer. Okay, now what is the point of my project? It is the following: that in today's logic we can identify a realist paradigm in Kuhn sense and the constructivist research program in Lakatos sense. The realist paradigm is given by model theory plus set theory. So they both have a semantic and a foundational side. The Kuhnian paradigm is given by model theory on the semantic side and set theory on the foundational side. Of course, they have to be taken together because one could well do model theory without being interested, for example, in foundational issues of set theory, and as well, one could do set theory without having any interest in looking for models of logical theories and so on. But if you take them together and you think of them as part of a logical investigation, this, of course, so I mean, this to my mind constitutes, I mean, a block, a theoretical block, where you have a sort of Kuhnian paradigm. And then next to this, or opposed to this, you have a constructivist research program. First difference between the realist paradigm and the constructivist research program is that constructivism is much more variegated than the other side. So to say, you have a number of theories which exemplify constructivism, and these theories share a number of principles, but may diverge from each other in quite substantial respects. So this already shows that constructivism is in a way more flexible than model theory and set theory, for example. And in the case of constructivism, I decided, as I said, to focus on Prawitz's proof-theoretic semantics and Martin-Löf's intuitionistic type theory. So we have a certain balance. So we have a paradigm and research program, semantic side in both cases, in one case model theory, in the other case Prawitz's proof-theoretic semantics, and foundational side set theory and Martin-Löf's intuitionistic type theory. Okay, so what is realism? For realism, so before speaking about that, I will make a sort of historical hypothesis, which is in any case, I mean, quite reasonable. I think that everyone will agree. According to this hypothesis, the history of contemporary logic can be split into two macro stages. The first one going from 1879 with the publication of Frege's Begriffsschrift to 1930, when Gödel proved his incompleteness results. And the second one going from 1930 onward with this, and I call the first one the foundational stage, and the second one the metalinguistic stage. Now, of course, you can take also, I mean, to my mind, the new logic starts with Frege's Begriffsschrift. Of course, you can also think, so some say that it starts really with the Bohl's laws of thought. So, I mean, it depends on what you take to be, who you take to be the father of contemporary logic. But so Gödel's theorems represent a watershed, of course, because as we know, they showed that the foundational projects were not, were unattainable, or they put into troubles these foundational projects. So in particular, Gödel's first incompleteness theorem shows that the logicist program is unattainable. Gödel's second incompleteness theorem, according to many, shows that the Hilbert's program is unattainable, and also Gödel's theorem are problematic for the intuitionistic project because they show in a sense that the truth and probability are not, distinct notions, and of course, since intuitionists identify truth with the existence of a proof, they have to rethink the notion of proof, pay more attention to how this notion is defined. So in a sense, Gödel's theorems are very relevant also for the intuitionistic project. But of course, Gödel's incompleteness theorems came after what Weil called the crisis of the foundations of mathematics, which was provoked by these semantic and theoretic paradoxes, and they are of course connected with these paradoxes because, for example, they show that Russell's type theory cannot do what it was intended to do, and we know that Russell's type theory is an emendation of Frege's system, which was affected by Russell's paradox, whereas also Hilbert's program with the Hilbert's idea of proving consistency of arithmetic analysis and set theory, according to certain reconstructions, this was because Hilbert was worried by the set theoretic, especially set theoretic, but also semantic paradoxes. And after this Gödelian storm, two relatively new approaches emerged. And now I say relatively new because, of course, these approaches were there already much before, in some cases, Gödel's incompleteness theorems. But to my mind, it's only after Gödel's incompleteness theorems that these two approaches, model theory and set theory, became dominant. So in particular, Gödel's incompleteness theorems are taken to show that the truth and probability are not the same, and this can be generalized by taking semantics and syntax not to be the same, and to the idea that you have to distinguish syntax and semantics and take the semantics to be, in a sense, a meta language with respect to an object language, which comes without meaning and uninterpreted. And in fact, Tasky's analysis of semantic paradoxes is to the effect that these paradoxes depend on this semantic closure once you have to distinguish the object language from the meta language. And of course, also, this led to a semantic notion of consequence, the idea that, of course, you don't have to define consequence as derivability in some sufficiently powerful system, but in terms of truth preservation of the conclusion with respect to the premises. I just want to remark that this idea that you should distinguish the object language from the meta language, and that the object language is meaningless and uninterpreted, whereas the meta language is the place where you interpret the object language, was not there before. Of course, we have this idea by Hilbert that you must distinguish mathematics from meta-mathematics, but this is not the idea that in meta-mathematics you develop semantic notions for mathematics. I would say that it is quite on the contrary. Meta-mathematics is a sort of formalization of contextual mathematics, which is there because you can deal more easily with formal mathematics. Whereas in Tasky, the idea is that the semantic notions have to be defined in the meta language, and the object language a priori has no language. Of course, again, this comes from Hilbert because you have this idea of formal systems as structures which can be interpreted over different domains, but this is quite different from saying that the object language has no meaning. Of course, set theory was there much before Gödel's incompleteness theorems. We already have some notions of set that play. In Frege, for example, we have this notion, of course, of values, which is a sort of notion of set. Of course, we have Cantor's naive set theory. We have Zermelo's paper from 1908. But I would say that the idea that the foundations of mathematics can be given by just devising these axiomatic set theories was not there before. Why? Well, because even if we had axiomatic set theories before Gödel's incompleteness theorems, for example, the attitude of Hilbert's school with respect to these axiomatic set theories is not that these set theories or theory, in the case of Zermelo, provide foundations for mathematics, but they are just part of mathematics, and you have to prove that they are consistent for providing foundations to mathematics. So it is not simply because you can reproduce the whole of mathematics in them that they are foundational. You have to prove their consistency. And this additional step, it seems not to be there any longer, and it just takes set theory to be a good way for providing foundations for mathematics, because you can reproduce mathematics in this theory. So a sort of extensional approach. Now, what about Prawitz's and Martin-Löf's theories? Well, they share a number. So this was about realism, now about constructivism. They share a number of sources: BHK semantics, which is the intuitionistic explanation of meaning based on the notion of proof, which of course leads to a rejection of the excluded middle of principle of bivalence of truth and so on. Then you have Gensen's proof theory with sequent calculus and natural deduction, and in particular with this idea which was put forward by Gensen in his 1935 paper that of course results like cut elimination, but above all this idea that you can take the introduction rules of natural deduction to define the meaning of the logical constants, whereas the eliminations can be shown in a sense to follow from this definition of meaning. This was crucial in particular for Prawitz's proof-theoretic semantics, but also in Martin-Löf's intuitionistic type theory. This, at the propositional level, you have this idea at play. And also this idea of harmony between introduction and elimination. So whence, and also, of course, in general, the idea that you can take some rules as providing meaning and that you can justify rules from other rules based on this meaning determination. Then on a more philosophical plan, we have Dammet's verificationism. This is more in Prawitz, but also in Martin-Löf. Dammet's verificationism is basically the idea that you should develop a verificationist theory of meaning. And this comes after Dammet's criticism of a realist semantics, where a realist semantics is basically semantics or a theory of meaning where you explain meaning based on a notion of truth, where truth is understood in a bivalent way. And Dammet has these arguments to the effect that these kind of meaning theories violate what he calls the manifestability requirement or principle, and therefore they are inadequate. And finally, and this is more important in Martin-Löf, but also at play in Prawitz somewhere, we have this carry-over isomorphism, and this proposition as types conception. So basically, what is important here is that we have this bijection between natural deduction derivations and terms from type lambda calculus, and this bijection is an isomorphism in the sense that it preserves certain reducibility conditions between derivations in natural deduction and terms in type lambda calculus. So in particular, a reduction, which is a procedure by which you eliminate a detour in natural deduction derivation, where a detour is a formula occurrence, which is at the same time the conclusion of an introduction and the major premise of an elimination, which corresponds to a redex in type lambda calculus and can be eliminated through corresponding reduction. And you can prove via these reductions in natural deduction that every derivation can be reduced to one without detours. And this is preserved by the bijection because you can show the same basically for type lambda terms, mutatis mutandis. And this is very important. Now, this normalization result is important in particular for Prawitz. Prawitz's proof-theoretic semantics, which in a sense can be understood as a sort of semantic generalization of Prawitz's normalization theorems for natural reduction. These theorems, as I said, show that this is a detour. You may already know this, but this is reduced by applying this function which transforms this derivation or this part of derivation into the right-hand side. By applying iteratively reduction steps of this kind, you reduce derivations to a form without any detour. And in some cases, which are, of course, the most relevant, you can prove that this possibility of reducing derivations to their normal form have a number of interesting side consequences, among which this corollary that whenever you can prove a formula under no assumptions, then this formula can be proved by introduction. Okay, that every closed normal derivation will end by applying an introduction. And this can, in a sense, be taken to confirm Jensen's claim that introductions fix the meaning of the logical constants, because, of course, a closed derivation is a closed proof. And since we are using proofs semantically, we know, at least since Frege, that saturated entities are prior over unsaturated entities. So closed proofs are more important than open proofs, or are taken to be more important. And then normal derivations are derivations which basically are the deductive kernel. When you have a non-normal derivation, you will have some redundant steps. When you have a normal derivation, this will be the real deductive kernel of the derivation. So the quintessential proof that the derivation represents, so to say. So the derivation is closed, the derivation is normal, and then for objects of this kind, you have that they must end by applying an introduction in the last step. And then if you go to the immediate subderivations, if they're closed, they again end by applying an introduction. So basically, you will only have introductions up to the open subparts of the derivation, which means basically that these introduction steps are valid by default in a sense, which is a confirmation, at least can be taken to be a sort of confirmation. And based on these ideas, Prawitz, of course, wants to develop a notion of proof derivation, which is semantic in nature, which means that his notion of derivation must not be limited to a fixed stock of rules, because the notion of proof is not so limited. A proof is not an object in a formal system. It's something that convinces you of the truth of its conclusion. So you must relax the kind of rules that you can use in derivations. And for this reason, Prawitz introduces these arbitrary argument structures, and it takes introductions to be valid by default, and takes inferences which are not in introduction form to be something that has to be justified through operations of this kind, but of course adapted to the kind of generalized non-introduction inferences that we may use. And then he introduced a criterion for saying when such a structure is valid relative to a certain assignment of reductions. The structure is valid when it can be reduced basically to a form ending by an introduction, whose immediate substructures are also valid relative to the same assignment. So this is when the structure is closed, it has no bound assumptions. When the structure has some unbound assumptions, you require that validity obtains by closure. Whenever you replace the assumptions with closed valid arguments for the assumptions, the result you obtain is a valid closed argument for the conclusion. Martin-Löf type theory, in a nutshell, is basically, as I see it, a class of formal systems where the distinctive trait is that you don't prove derivations of these systems, you don't prove formulas but judgments. A judgment is something of the form little a colon capital A, meaning that little a is a proof object of the proposition A. Capital A is the proposition. Of course, the proposition is a type, so it is the class of its proofs, and vice versa. A class identifies a proposition saying that that class is inhabited. So this is the formulas type conception underlying the carryover isomorphism that we already saw. And of course, there may be other kinds of judgments. So for example, you can have little a equals little b colon capital A, meaning that A and B are equal proof objects for the same proposition. You have these dependent types. So you say that something is a type depending on whether some variables it contains have certain types. You have dependent proof objects saying that something is a proof object of a certain type depending on whether the variables which may be involved have certain types and so on. But in general, these systems will include four kinds of rules: formation rules, where you build types. So in Martin-Löf's type theory, you build a language from within the system, in a sense. This is important for what we shall say afterward. Then you have introduction rules, which basically establish how the canonical elements of a type are formed, what are basically the elements of a type. Elimination rules, which permit you to define functions over types. And then you have equality rules, which basically show how the functions that you have defined through the elimination rules can be computed over the elements of the type. Now, why? So what is important to remark here? First, that, as I said, the language is built from within the system, which means basically that you don't have a distinction between object language and meta language, at least not officially. There are some projects where you develop models for intuitionistic type theory, but they are not orthodox in the sense that, in principle, if you have intuitionistic type theory, you don't need any model. And so, in particular, the rules which you give in the system are valid, not because they are truth-preserving with respect to some model, but because they are valid by meaning explanation. Martin-Löf's words are that you have to make the rule immediately evident by yourself, something like this. So, based on the way judgments are explained, you have to see that rules are valid, and that is all. And also, of course, truth is not a meta-predicate. But you have this form of judgment, A true, which basically is understood as an abbreviation, as a synthetic form of an analytic form, little a colon capital A. So basically, this is the constructivist explanation of the notion of truth in terms of existence of a proof. But this explanation is basically given through a derived rule where you take A true to be the conclusion and little a colon capital A to be the premise. So basically, truth means that you have an available proof object showing that the proposition is inhabited, the type that the proposition is inhabited, okay? And this is not a meta-predicate, or from the same point of view, if you say that truth means existence of a proof, you don't take this existence as propositional in nature, okay? So to my mind, this can be understood as true is more, so it is like the assertion sign in Frege. Okay, this is the way, to my mind, true works in type theory. This is the way the expression true works in type theory. Okay, now I have to substantiate two claims that model theory and set theory are realist and they are a paradigm. Well, what is realism? Well, of course, this is not an easy question, but I take a realist approach in logic to be identified by basically two facts. The first one is that you have a bivalent notion of truth, or some bivalent semantic core notion at play. Bivalent means that every bearer of this notion either enjoys a certain property or fails to enjoy that property. So, in particular, every truth bearer is either true or false, determinately either true or false. We assume this from at the outset. And then that the object structures, entities that you deal with in your theory are there independently of whether you can come into possession of them, you can know them, you can build them. So their existence in a sense transcends any possibility of having some form of epistemic access to these object structure and entities. This qualifies an approach as realist, and to me, at least, I mean, in this context, and from my point of view, it is unquestionable that both model theory and set theory work with these assumptions in the background. So you take, for example, satisfiability to be something which either holds or fails for atomic formulas in a language. Okay, you have these assumptions at play. Why are they a paradigm? Well, for the time being, let us assume that they can be understood as a paradigm in Kuhn's sense. And now the question is, how do they relate with the previous approach? Now here I say that Frege created a paradigm. I shall say in the conclusion that this may not be true because the foundational stage with Frege, Hilbert, and Brouwer basically can be understood as made up of research programs, which are not yet paradigms. But for the time being, let us refer to what Frege did as a paradigm. Okay, this is simpler in a way. Now the question is, how do model theory and set theory understood as something which is at play in contemporary logic related to this previous approach? Are they a new paradigm, a sub-paradigm, or an evolution of Frege's paradigm? Okay, to my mind, they cannot be understood as a new paradigm because it is clear that they are connected and inherit many things from the previous approach by Frege, Hilbert, and the others. Just think, for example, of the way we devise formal languages, proposition, first order, second order, we distinguish predicate variables, we have this function argument approach and not a subject predicate approach. The way we devise formal systems, we have axioms or we can have natural deduction, but in any case, the way we prove facts about languages. And so all this is still part of model theory plus set theories. I will take that this is not a new paradigm. Can it be a sub-paradigm? Well, to my mind, this is not the case either, because in model theory and set theory, we have at least two ideas that were not there, to my mind, before. The first one is you have this object language, meta language distinction, that you can take an object language to be something which is meaningless and uninterpreted, just a set of strings produced out of some inductive definition, and then you provide an interpretation in the meta language for this formal object. But this was not there before. So, for example, Frege's language is a language which comes with a meaning. And even in the case of Hilbert, where you have an object language as a formal language, this object language is understood as a formalization of a contentual language. So, for example, when you have these theories for transfinite mathematics. And the second point is that the foundations of mathematics in the new approach is to be based on some specific axiomatic theory, which in particular is, for example, ZFC or some alternative axiomatic set theories like von Neumann, Bernays, Gödel, and so on. But previously, the idea was rather that you, of course, had to devise an axiomatic set theory, like, for example, Frege's set theory, but that this axiomatic set theory worked because of some philosophical reason. So, for example, in Frege, we have the idea that these axioms are sufficient because overall mathematics can be reduced to logic. In Hilbert, we have the idea that, in a sense, only finitary mathematics is self-justifying, and you have to provide a justification for the ideal part, and so on. It was not enough to devise this axiomatic set theory without this stronger principle at play. Whereas now, okay, you just take these axioms and say, I can redo all of mathematics in it, so this is enough. So to my mind, model theory plus set theory is an evolution of Frege's paradigm, which is there because of the crisis provoked by Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So it's a rethinking of that approach after Gödel's theorem. So this would be the idea. And now, can they be understood as a paradigm? Well, you can give historical and statistical reasons for this. Historical reasons are many. I will just focus on 3 of them. So, for example, Gödel, when speaking with Hao Wang, said that Sköllem was close to proving completeness of first-order logic, but he was not able to do so because of his too much constructivist attitude, whereas he was able to do that because he was proudly realist, or maybe even Platonist, he says. So this means that this realist framework that you have in model theory plus set theory is a winning strategy. It even permitted the young Gödel to prove completeness of first-order logic. Then, after Gödel's incompleteness results, we have this idea that derivability is a syntactic notion, whereas consequence, for example, is a semantic notion. This is a confirmation of the idea that you should split object language and meta language. So, yeah, we are on the right track if we adopt this approach. And of course, we have a quite successful treatment of paradoxes, both semantic and set theoretic. So these are achievements of this. Then you have statistical reasons. Of course, it is the quantitatively dominant approach. I mean, there are many people working in model theory, set theory. I mean, this is just data. Some open problems or anomalies are disregarded. So, for example, everything concerning epistemic problems is dealt with at most with these epistemic operators, which, I mean, are good, I mean, but not, for example, by bringing in proof objects or things that you have in constructive approaches to deal with epistemic problems concerning, for example, whether the notion of consequence should be epistemic in nature. The modality involved in consequence should be epistemic. When you say that the conclusion is something that you are compelled to by the premises, you're not simply saying that you have a modal operator which applies to the conclusion or to the relation between the premises and the conclusion, but according to the constructivist, for example, you're saying that you have a proof for going from the premises to the conclusion. Then there is an almost complete satisfaction of the textbook criterion. This is a criterion that Kuhn has. Basically, it says that you are in a paradigm. If whatever textbook you take, you will find that paradigm reproduced acritically in that textbook. And now if you take any textbook in mathematics, you take the first 2 chapters, you will have set theory, not necessarily axiomatic set theory. And even if you take some textbook in logic written by people working in the constructivist field, it will have model theory, at most Kripke's semantics. But you won't have, for example, type theory or the like. It's very unlikely that you will find, even for example, Van Dalen's logical structure, it has model theory. But if you take some work by Van Dalen in constructive mathematics, it is clear that he prefers, so I mean, not that he prefers, but that he's interested in other issues. And then if you go through the scholastic reforms from the 70s, the 80s, or the 90s, you will see that basically many countries in Europe or in the world were trying to teach kids basically that the number is a set of sets and that bijection is doing so. Basically, they use Piaget's idea. I never understood how to do this with French words, but Piaget's ideas about mathematics, and we know that Piaget in turn used the Bourbaki approach. So basically, this is okay. How much time do I have now?
7 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Including.
Okay. So I mean, I had better stop here. Maybe yeah, so perhaps I just want to say something about this notion of logical research program. Of course, this has to be made precise. The idea is that, of course, a logical research program is not something of the same kind as a physical research program because there is no confirmation, for example, in the outer world. So my idea is now that in this notion, you have a core which is made of a number of principles concerning some logically relevant notions like consequence or validity and the like. And then that the protective belt contains precise formalizations of these intuitive notions. Now, this very roughly, now this research program can be progressive or regressive and theoretically or empirically, depending on whether these formalizations are promising with respect to a better understanding of the principles contained in the core, not only promising in the sense that they are faithful with respect to these principles, but also in the sense that they seem to permit you to prove many interesting facts. And then it is empirically progressive when these definitions or proofs actually are there. Now, why I said before that the foundational stage could be understood also in terms of foundation of research programs and perhaps is best understood in that way. One example is, for example, Frege's notion of Frege's idea that mathematics could be reduced to logic. It was part of this notion that the notion of number could be defined in purely logical terms. And this was, of course, a great idea. And Frege not only proposed this idea, which would be part of its core, but even gave a definition showing that the program was at that time both theoretically and empirically progressive, because it not only promised such a definition, but even gave this definition. Another example is, of course, the partial consistency proofs that we had in Hilbert's program. So they were promising because Hilbert at one point even believed that the consistency of arithmetic was close to be proved. And these partial consistency proofs, as those, for example, by Ackermann or von Neumann, were very promising, of course. It looked like a grand foundational program. Unfortunately, it was wrong, but it has been progressive for a while. And now the idea is that of applying this notion of logical research program to proof-theoretic semantics and intuitionistic depth theory, and to make precise notions like positive heuristics, negative heuristics as referred to constructivism. But yes, and of course, another sensible point is what is the relation between this paradigm and this research program with respect to the previous stage. But I should stop here now, sorry. Okay, that's all, thank you.